Why do some countries only have a few political parties, but others have many? To understand why some countries have many political parties and others have only a couple, you need to know where political parties come from. Instead of using real-world countries, because obvious, let's world build some. First is the African nation of Maghreb. Maghreb is a democracy on the north coast of Africa and is home to two different people groups. There are the Spanish-speaking Maghrebis, who are from Iberia, and the Arabic-speaking Maghrebis, which are from Arabia. Most people live as farmers in the rural countryside in the east, while about a fifth of the people live in the capital city of Maghreb City. To put that into comparison, only about 3% of the people in America live in its largest city, New York City. Next, we have the Central American nation of Santa Maria. Santa Maria has a storied past. Originally a colony of Spain, there is a large Catholic population as well as a sizable indigenous population. Later, Santa Maria was taken over by England, and so there is a large Protestant population as well. Let's start with Maghreb. We can represent the population of Maghreb with a chart that shows the percentage of the population that's within each group. Rich Iberians who live in the city make up 10% of the entire country's population, and it's about the same for rich Arabs. Because living in the city is so expensive and the work is so highly skilled, poor people of any kind are virtually non-existent in the city. Rich Iberians in the countryside make up about 11% of the population, and rich Arabs in the countryside are about 13%. Poor Iberians in the countryside make up 29% of Maghreb's entire population, and Arabs in the same circumstance make up 27%. Altogether, these groups make up 100% of the population. These divisions that exist in Maghreb's demographics, like how much money someone makes, what ethnic group they're a part of, and whether they live in the city or the country, are called social cleavages. Social cleavages divide a society. But why did we pick these cleavages? Well, in any group of people, there are an infinite number of social cleavages, but some people care about more than others. It's easy to imagine that some people care quite a bit about the ethnic group that they're a part of, especially if it's currently or was historically repressed. Certain policies and government programs could benefit city dwellers more than those who live in the country, and the income gap has perhaps the most direct effect on people's lives. Because the cleavages are important to people, politicians will play to them to try to get elected. To get the rich Arab people in the country to vote for you, support policies that they would want. This is the key to understanding where political parties come from and why some issues get politicized while others don't. Let's say Maghreb is a presidential democracy. If you think you know what that means, you might not, but check this video to make sure. To get elected president, you need 50% of the vote plus 1. Anything more than that and you're wasting resources appealing to people that you don't need to, and anything less than that, you'll obviously lose. Candidates need to get as close to 50% as possible. Well, no single group in Maghreb has a large enough population. If someone wants to run, they need to find some combination that will give them as close to 50% as they can. The candidate could pick two completely different groups, but the policies each would support would be completely different, so candidates and political parties try to appeal to similar groups. A candidate could appeal to urbanites, but would get only 20% of the vote. If they appealed to country dwellers, they get 80% of the vote. Enough to win, but well above what they need. Iberians and Arabs each have about 50% of the population, so that's what candidates will play to. In presidential elections for Maghreb, there will be two political parties, and the politics will largely be ethnic-based. Political parties come about as a way of politicians to become more credible to voters. Imagine that Maghreb has a term limit for presidents. Eventually, there's going to be two completely new candidates, and one of them comes up to run and says that they support all of these policies that some group likes. How would the voters tell if they were being honest? If she were part of a political party that took official stances on policies, it would be much more credible for voters. Political parties often have a lot of money that can help you get elected, so it would be best to act in line with the party. Strong political parties offer more security for voters, to know that the candidates won't renege on their promises for fear of losing any funding, and also for ostracism once they get into government, if they do. Now let's look at Maghrebi legislative elections. We're going to assume, unrealistically, that Maghreb elects only a couple people to the legislature. They use a proportional system across the whole country, meaning that whatever percentage of votes a party gets, that's how many seats they get in the legislature. There's a problem though, there are only 4 seats up for election, so effectively you need to get 25% of the vote to get a seat. How many political parties would there be now? Well, the Eastern Poor Iberians and Eastern Poor Arabs each have enough to get a seat, so a party will form around each of those groups. For the remaining groups, there are some options. An East Rich and a West Rich party would each get about as many votes as they would need, but so would a Rich Arab and a Rich Iberian party. I'm going to say that since the elections for president focus on the Iberian-Arab cleavage, that those are the two parties that are going to be the ones to try to win legislative seats. Maghreb would effectively have 4 political parties for the legislature and 2 effective parties for presidential elections. But what if Maghreb had 10 seats? and you only needed 10% of the vote to get a seat. Now things change a lot. A party appealing to rich Western Iberians could get a seat, as would a rich Western Arabian party. Same with rich Eastern Arabs and Iberians. So now Maghreb has 6 political parties. But in real life, countries have hundreds of seats in the legislatures, but only a few parties. The US has 2, but has 435 seats available. What's going on? In some countries like Belgium and Israel, they do have tons of parties in the legislature, but the answer as to why the US, for example, doesn't is easy. There are smaller districts for each seat in the legislature that elect only one person. So think back to that presidential election. US legislative elections are like mini presidential elections. Israel and Belgium have their entire country as one large district. Imagine how low the bar is to get elected. The interesting thing comes about when all the districts don't look the same. Some districts may have more of one type of voter than another district. Let's go back to Maghreb and make 2 districts. One of them is for the capital, Maghreb City, and elects 1 representative. The other is for everywhere else, and elects 3 representatives. The populations of the 2 districts are roughly 3 to 1, let's say. Something interesting happens when we look at the makeup of each district. In Maghreb, most of the Westerners are rich, so the capital city is only split among the Arab-Iberian divide. You need 50% of the vote to win a single seat, and each group is about 50% of the citizens within this district. Locally, we get parties focusing on the Arab-Iberian cleavage. In the East, things are much different. With 3 seats, you need 33% of the vote to get elected. Poor Iberians and poor Arabs each have their own parties, since within the district, they still make up a large enough proportion. But now rich Iberians and Arabs don't have enough on their own to get elected, and can't rely on the voters in the West since now they're in a different district. In this scenario, a party would form around the rich Easterners. Now Maghreb has 5 political parties. You might now start to understand why some politicians want to make it harder for some groups to vote, or even remove their ability to vote altogether. Just the existence of districts changes the number of parties and what platform they'll have. They also make regional cleavages more important than dispersed ones. In the UK Independence Party, also known as UKIP, has a large amount of support, and in 2015 it received 13% of all the votes cast in the election. But UKIP supporters are very geographically dispersed and not concentrated in one area, and because the UK elections are all single-member districts, UKIP won only 1 seat, the one district where they just so happened to make up a majority of voters. The Scottish National Party is a Scotland-focused party, and even though it has a small amount of support, it does quite well in elections since it can get a majority in some of the UK's single-member districts, namely the ones in Scotland. Districts make some social cleavages politically salient, that is, something that politicians can play to successfully get elected, and make other cleavages non-salient. The reason some countries have high ethnically based parties and others don't comes down to how the districts divide up the population, and what cleavages need to be played to get elected. When a country is divided up into many single-member districts, then safe districts can appear. Say that Maghreb chooses to have a ton of smaller districts, and that each elect a single representative. In one of the districts, there might just so happen to be more Arabs than Iberians, and so the Arab party would almost always win this district. It makes the elections really come down to the swing districts, which have roughly equal proportions and could go either way. This happens a lot in the US. There are safe Republican states, there are safe Democratic states, and even within swing states, there are Republican safe and Democratic safe districts. Majoritarian rules with a single representative really limit the number of effective political parties to about 2, even if the country or district is diverse. Third parties in countries with majoritarian rules only really have a chance if they play to geographically concentrated groups in local districts or local elections. And even then, they'll have to compete with the much larger and more well-funded national parties. Let's move from Maghreb to Santa Maria. Santa Maria is a much less diverse place than Maghreb. Maghreb had a lot of subgroups of approximately equal size. Santa Maria does not. Almost all of the indigenous are Catholic, and almost all of the Europeans are Protestant. Catholic natives are about 51% of the population, Catholic Europeans are 1%, Protestant natives are 2%, and Protestant Europeans are 46%. Not surprisingly, the presidential elections feature 2 main political parties, and they're based on the European native divide. They're also heavily focused on religion, though the Protestant European Party isn't as focused since they have to try to win over some of the Catholic Europeans as well if they want a realistic chance of winning elections. If the country elected 4 representatives, just like Maghreb, to its legislature in one countrywide district, it would have 2 political parties. Same if it elected 10 or 20. Only if the country elected 50 members in one single district nationwide would another party, focused on the Protestant natives, be able to get a seat. In Maghreb, adding more seats allowed for more parties, but in Santa Maria, this isn't the case. Santa Maria's cleavages reinforce each other, where the Maghreb ones are cross-cutting. The number of parties in a country is determined by how cross-cutting the country's cleavages are and how proportional the voting rules are. The social cleavages provide the potential for many parties, and the voting rules are the valve that control whether those parties can come into existence. But why do some political parties change their platforms when the voting districts don't change? Let's look at Santa Maria. Imagine that the social cleavage the parties chose to play was the ethnic one. All is well and good, but as time goes on, religious mixing occurs. More and more natives start to become Protestant, and more Europeans start to become Catholic. At some point, the cleavage becomes more cross-cutting than reinforcing. The existing parties can continue to play to the same group, but what happens if the native population starts growing? Suddenly, the native party starts winning by a huge margin, and the European party realizes that if it wants to start winning elections again, it has to change its platform. It switches to start appealing to Protestants, and the native party stops wasting its resources appealing to voters that it doesn't need and starts appealing to Catholics. It's easy to imagine another demographic shift that could cause the parties to switch entirely and go back to being ethnic-based, but opposite of what they were originally. Something very similar to this happened in the United States, where the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, socially and economically speaking, were pretty much reversed at the beginning of the 20th century. These imaginary lines that divide up a country into voting districts can have a huge effect on politics and even people's opinions. Along the border of Zambia and Malawi, there are two ethnic groups called the Chuas and the Tumbukas. The Chuas and Tumbukas are quite culturally different. Chuas speak Chichua and dance the Nyao, while Tumbukas speak Chitumbuka and dance the Vinbuza. Chua families need to pay a chicken to have their daughters married, but Tumbukas need to hand over 7 entire cattle. A political scientist named Daniel Posner went to 4 villages along the border of Zambia and Malawi and interviewed the residents. These villages were both incredibly close to each other and to their neighbors across the border. He found that in Malawi, 61% of the citizens of both ethnic groups said that they would not vote for a presidential candidate from the other ethnic group, and 55% said that they wouldn't even marry someone from the other ethnic group. But in Zambia, things were a completely different story. Only 21% of people from both ethnic groups said that they wouldn't vote for a candidate from the other, and only 24% said that they wouldn't marry someone from the other ethnic group. The ethnic cleavage seems to be more salient in Malawi than Zambia. The reason for this lies in the demographics of Zambia and Malawi, and is really the result of the imaginary lines that the Europeans drew back when they were colonizing the continent that divided up tribes and ethnic groups. In both countries, the elections for the legislature are small, single-member districts. In Malawi, the Chuas make up 57% of the population, so it makes sense for any political party to play to that ethnic cleavage. In Zambia, the Chuas make up only 7%, and the Tumbukas are only about 4%. Neither has any chance of winning a majority in a district, so political parties have to look elsewhere. The way that Malawi politicians have to get elected is to play to the ethnic differences of people, and so there's more ire between the two groups even outside of politics. Knowing what social cleavages exist in your country, as well as where people live and what the voting districts are like, will tell you everything about how politics will play out. Worried that ethnic tensions will be too high? Design the districts for your country so that the ethnicity cleavage isn't a viable election strategy. Depending on how cross-cutting or reinforcing the cleavages are, you may be able to adjust what platforms political parties will run on, and possibly weaken or intensify the tension between different groups within your country. Almost all of how politics plays out comes down to the rules that politics is played by, not surprisingly.